Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the co-founder and CEO with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We have helped pharmaceutical companies from across the globe over the past 14 years to help them with virtualizing almost everything, from their advisory and consultancy meetings, medical education, peer influence programs. So we take a series of touch points with their payers, physicians, allied healthcare providers, patients, and payers. And we actually work together in a series of touch points to help figure out strategies, ideas, tactics, new programs, clinical trials, and dispersing of medical information. But more importantly at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from some of these really big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, the digital provocateurs, and the healthcare thought leaders, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm very excited to having one of these healthcare thought leaders at the table with me today. This is actually Larry Bressler. He is the head of value and market access, global rare diseases at Chiesi Group, where he addresses the commercial and market access needs of marketed as well as candidate treatments for things like rare and ultra rare diseases. So he has over 20 years of pharmaceutical industry experience. He brings a range of proficiency across rare diseases as well as primary care, pharmaceutical, as well as vaccine sales and marketing. So prior to joining Chiesi Rare Diseases, Larry has served as the VP for global launch lead for a company called Rhythm Pharmaceuticals. At that company, he was responsible for leading launch strategy as well as developing solutions for physicians, including the creation of a global genetic testing program. So Larry also held various leadership roles at Shire, where he led pre-launch global commercial planning into the disease areas of eosinophilic esophagitis, that's a mouthful, and hereditary angioedema. So before moving into the rare disease space, which we're going to get into some discussions today, because this is an area that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are getting into, Lawrence has held a series of roles of increasing responsibility at GlaxoSmithKline as well as at Merck. Welcome, Larry. So happy to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Natalie. Really happy to be here.
So quite a career, lots of exciting things. You've worked in a myriad of global Fortune 500 pharmaceutical companies. So an extensive background. Maybe we can just kind of get started with how you actually ever got into the place you're working in now, and specifically your interest in rare disorders.
Yeah, so I was at Rhythm for a number of years, and Chiesi approached me probably about three years ago, and they really had I thought it was a very interesting opportunity, because we'll get into this I think a little bit later, but the nature of Chiesi being a family corporation, being a certified B corporation, was really kind of unique. I'd spent a lot of time in public companies, and there was just kind of a different vibe associated with Chiesi that was drawing me to the company, as well as the opportunity to build out a rare disease team. So I mean, I started in 2020, probably not the greatest timing to build a team, but the attraction was to build a team both in market access on the global side in the US, as well as on the regional side in Parma, Italy, where the company is headquartered, and also to add to my experience around marketing, to add market access into my basket. Up until Chiesi, I'd primarily been in marketing and some sales roles, but really marketing, heavy duty for about 20 years. So it was really the opportunity to come to a kind of unique place to build and to add to my toolbox with market access experience. I think you asked me also about like rare disease, because what brought me there, because as mentioned earlier, I think when you went through my profile, I'd spent a long time in some bigger pharmaceutical companies, more in the primary care space, vaccines, and also in the statin market. And what really brought me over to rare disease was that nexus with the patient. It was the opportunity to really impact patients, one patient at a time. Yet you don't really have that close proximity to patients when you're in a larger market with millions of patients. I mean, Some of the products we're working on at Chiesi, we might have 100 patients in the country who have a condition. So you really get to meet and interact with the patients really closely, and really understand what they're experiencing. We do that in primary care markets, but in rare disease, you really need to understand that patient journey, the language they use, and you really get to almost walk in their shoes. And that's probably not fair to say, because if you don't have the condition or one of these conditions, it's really hard to fully understand it. But we really try hard to get very close and to have that I've used the word nexus, but that's really what we try to do here.
Very exciting. And, it really has to be said. We use the word customer centricity a lot in pharma. Some people, it's more of a cliche. Other people really believe in it. But I think really in the case of Chiesi, that it is fundamentally part of your business plan. So let's actually just start there a little bit. Is you have worked for large pharmaceutical companies, GSK, Merck, and others. And so we're used to the phenomena of the blockbuster going over the big, large therapeutic areas where basically the drug sells itself. Now we're actually in a very different world. The pharmaceutical companies, there's patent cliffs, there's no longer these big blockbusters, there's lots of challenges with legacy reimbursement models. Tell us a little bit about what you believe has been the transition of pharmaceutical companies building their businesses on these large therapeutic spaces, cardiovascular, diabetes, and pivoting, if you will, into these much more niche marketplaces. Why has that happened? And what has been your experience of the new change in the pharmaceutical business model?
Yeah, well, I think that what I've noticed is, as you mentioned, with a lot of the large pharmaceutical companies, I was at Merck. Merck was for years was a cardiovascular juggernaut. Just new innovative therapies, one after the other. And over time, I think a lot of let's say the low-hanging fruit from cardiovascular, even respiratory, a lot of that's already been discovered. So it makes it harder and harder to come up with a solution that's so much better than what's already generic. So I think the companies have smartly realized that, in order to survive and thrive, you really need to move into more specialty markets. You might not have the same number of patients that you do in a larger primary care space, but you have the opportunity to treat some that are people that have truly unmet needs, whether it's in respiratory with someone who has a very acute and severe case of asthma, treating them with some of the new modalities that are out there. Pivoting to look in that direction, I think, is smart, because really at the end of the day, what the drug industry really is focused on is unmet needs, meeting those needs. And I think also a lot of the pharmaceutical industry realized, rare disease. There was the Waxman-Hatchet years ago, and a lot of legislation around jumpstarting rare disease as a viable market, frankly. And I think a lot of the pharma companies now realize that this is an area of tremendous unmet need. I think I've seen between 7,000 and 10,000 diseases. There's some that are probably more akin now to a primary care space, and that there's a lot of competition, but there are thousands of diseases with probably tens of thousands, if not millions, of people who are still searching for answers. And I think pharma can provide that solution. So it's exciting to be in this. We in the company I'm in right now, we come across so many different conditions and so many different people on a daily basis. You just don't, it's not like you know everything about rare diseases. There's so many of them. It's exciting and intriguing to see what solutions we can bring.
So it's a really interesting question. So pharma has now pivoted into an area that, where there's a lot of potential research. There's a very finite number of people across the globe that has particular disorders. How do pharmaceutical companies determine which of these myriad of rare situations, conditions, disorders that they're going to select and start working and researching on? How does that actually even start?
It's a good question. I'm not sure like the initial jump in is necessarily that choiceful. it might be just something that you have and, in the clinic that you find that treats a rare disease. And, when I was at Rhythm, we were working on an obesity product, and which has since been approved for some rare conditions of obesity. But initially, it wasn't necessarily going to be used for, rare disease. So I think sometimes you might find that you have something that fits with a rare disease, and other times it might be more choiceful. But I think what once you kind of establish a beachhead in rare, you're looking for things that are probably more tangential or closely aligned with what you're in. So for example, at Chiesi, we have a number of products for lysosomal storage disorders. So, looking for the synergies of, who's treating those diseases and bringing multiple solutions in that category to the physician. So, physicians get to know you, the community gets to know you, and you build on those relationships. I think it's a lot harder, for a company to be focusing on one space and to go in something completely different. It's not that will never happen, and I can't say it won't ever happen at Chiesi, but it makes it easier if you can kind of focus on an area, build the expertise, and then kind of expand outward from there.
So you did mention that Chiesi's headquarters is in Italy, and you were asked basically to kind of come in and, I guess, start up the U.S. Local operating company. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. So I was brought in to start up the marketing and market access function. So the way we're organized, the global headquarters for Chiesi Rare Disease is actually in Boston, which is much different than the rest of the company. And then, in Boston, we have somebody who is the U.S. lead, so really kind of running the U.S. sales team and operations. You have me, who's really running the marketing and market access. And then we have some folks in Italy who are running the European and emerging markets part of the business. My role is kind of across both the U.S. and the global side. So I get to see what's happening on both sides of the pond and do a lot of traveling these days too.
Absolutely. So the market access is probably an incredibly, like you said, it's a new but an incredibly challenging and interesting area. So I think one of the challenges for pharmaceutical companies across the world, especially now that people are intently looking at global access and effective global launches, is the whole legacy market access reimbursement structures and frameworks. Now, I guess rare disorders are orchestrated or developed, and they're very expensive to develop. Maybe we can kind of start from there about why rare disorder clinical trials and why they are so difficult, and why these products are so expensive.
Yeah, well, first of all, in the clinical trials, I think first of all, think about in many cases you're working in a disease that the regulatory bodies don't know anything about. So even just figuring out what the endpoints need to be, like how do you actually prove that you are improving someone's life? It's not, I harken back to my days on the statin market where, when you're lowering LDL cholesterol, that is an accepted, way of showing that you're improving, the cardiovascular long-term outcomes. And then there were outcome studies on top of that. Here, we don't necessarily always know what good looks like. So there's a lot of back and forth with the agency to even set up the trial. And then, think about a condition that might have 200 people in the country, or 200 people in Europe. Trying to find them is very difficult. So just the trials, setting them up are very, very expensive. And and that, in order to fund the R&D, the prices need to be there too, because otherwise no one would be able to go into this space if you couldn't actually make a return on it. I think one thing that's really unique about our company being a family business, we take a much more long-term view. We don't, our shareholders is the family, we interact with them, and, but my actual manager is Giacomo Chiesi. He's the grandson of the founder of the company. So, he's one of the board members. So, he's influencing how we're looking at things and taking that long-term view. But again, profitability is important, to sustain the business. We need to find conditions that, we think we can make a return. But again, the trials are very expensive, and they're, it starts with regulatory, it goes through actually finding people to be in the studies. And it can take quite a long time to actually get a therapy approved. But again, it's really rewarding too at the same rate. I mean, you're bringing a solution to people who, in many cases, have nothing on the market and no other options. And you can change someone's life expectancy pretty substantially if you can get a drug on the market in time for them to truly benefit from the therapy. So that's what I think keeps us going at Chiesi, and I'm sure my counterparts at other rare disease companies.
So how involved, as we were talking earlier about patient centricity, and some companies that their entire business model is built on that. How involved are the actual patients and their caregivers in, for example, the development of a clinical trial, in terms of the protocol development, even in terms of the endpoints that are selected? And how are they involved potentially with the regulatory bodies?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So at Chiesi and other companies, we try to bring in the voice of the patient very early on. So whether we're designing a phase 2 or a phase 3 study, that the essence of truly building a study that's going to be meaningful for the community means getting their feedback. So we are, I mean, really, again, patients at the center of everything we do. We work really closely through our advocacy team to bring in that voice of the patient into the development, and also on the regulatory side. And we haven't, some companies have used patients to actually bring that voice into the FDA, and the FDA now has a mechanism to bring that patient voice in. So we work really closely with the agency to help facilitate bringing the voice of the patients in, regardless of whether it's a disease that we have a direct impact on or not. I think what's important is giving the patients an opportunity to have their say. And if you don't, you really missed an opportunity to do the right thing. I mean, I will say again, at our company, it's not lip service that we really strive to be patient centric and have the patients at the center. It is everything we do. And we even start our meetings off, some of our larger meetings off, with a patient story. I mean, it is so heavily embedded that if we didn't include the patient voice in regulatory or in the clinical side, I think it would almost be strange for us, because it's become such a part of our DNA.
So for rare disorder specialty companies like yourselves, is finding these patients, it's sort of like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
Advocacy groups are obviously a beautiful thing to have, because they're probably assisting, especially around clinical trial recruitment and other sorts of initiatives. Outside of that, how do you find these patients? And the reason I'm asking that question with an emphasis is that primary care physicians are inundated with information. And now with the roar around rare disorders, they're even on overwhelm of trying to identify all of these very generalist symptoms and trying to bring people in. How do you even go about doing that early diagnosis?
Yeah, it's another great question. I mean, I can't imagine being a primary care physician and trying to identify a multitude of these conditions, because I mean, I don't think you can really be expected to know everything about everything. I mean, some of these diseases are certainly very unique, and you would never recognize them unless you were looking for it. So I mean, what we do, I think you made a good point about the advocacy groups, but in some cases there is really no advocacy group present. So you're really trying to figure out the patient journey and how a patient kind of walks through the system, which could be 7 to 10 years before they get diagnosed. But again, in a rare disease case, even that 7 to 10 years, if it's a disease with no advocacy group and symptoms that are not very unique, they may never get identified. So what a couple things we do. I mean, beyond the traditional Facebook presence and websites and symposia around the condition, a couple things that pharmaceutical companies will do. One is offering genetic testing. There's a number of programs that the pharmaceutical companies have offered, which they're free to the provider. As long as someone has a is suspected of having a condition that, based on some clinical presentation, they can get genetically tested, and that's come down in price. It used to be, thousands of dollars to get a genetic test. Now it's a couple hundred depending on where you go. So that's one way of doing it. But I'd say the other way that's really started to advance is the use of intelligence, big data sets, and going through claims data and looking at symptoms for your condition that match up to people who have claims in the data set. Excuse me. So we'll comb through the claims data to find basically patients that look like patients that might have the condition, and through that we would know, hey, Dr. So and so has a number of patients in their practice, and we at least can identify where some of the patients are, and tailor our marketing to those physicians, and so on and so forth. But again, that is very difficult. I mean, you get a lot of false positives, but through a combination of AI and through genetic testing and marketing and getting involved, trying to put yourself out to the community, trying to find people through market research, you ultimately can find people, but it's challenging. We have a condition right now that we're bringing to market where patient finding is challenging because it's just not diagnosed in the U.S. and there's no procedural code that says so and so has this disease. So we do our best, but that is, I'd say, a lot of what we do in the industry is around shortening that journey, finding and educating patients and their caregivers, and then trying to connect them to a therapy. But there's no magic bullet. But it's again, it's the same thing as I said earlier. When you do find somebody who didn't realize they had a condition, and fingers crossed that the therapy works for them, it's magic. I mean, it can really change lives.
Yeah, really brilliant. That's an amazing, when you hear the trajectory of that is certainly a challenge for not only the pharmaceutical company, but certainly for the patients as well. So I was also just curious, as we sort of think about the way we're locating and finding patients, is, what the access part of it. So even if they do find the drug and they do see that there's something could work, and they've been diagnosed appropriately, is these products are very expensive. Now, the corollary to this as well too is it's not only just because of the work that's required in these very difficult clinical trials, but oftentimes these medications are developed with really highly technical tools, things like CRISPR, and there's, and again, even in oncology, there's oncotherapeutics and small molecules and all sorts of things that are very difficult to create. So the technologies are really advanced. And we're facing, at the same time, legacy regulatory and reimbursement models that are not willing, if you will, to accept the price tags associated with these, very advanced technologies. So what do we do in this situation? What are some of the things that the pharmaceutical companies are doing to start to change the ecosystem and get people to start understanding why these price tags are warranted, and why the rare disorder space, or precision medicine, if you will, be able to precisely find these people and get them the right medications? How do we start changing that dialogue?
A lot of it, I think, in my experience, has been around education with the payers, starting from there, meeting with them, informing them, educating, so that they're, first of all, they're not surprised by what's coming, and then getting their feedback and incorporating it into your go-to-market strategy. One thing that most companies do before something comes to market is there's these pre-approval education meetings that you're allowed to have with the payers within about a 6-month period of an approval. So, through that, there's education about the condition and, potentially the modality, although you obviously can't get into the product itself. So there's a lot of education that we can do. The other thing is, exploring new reimbursement models. We've seen in many cases there's, there's kind of an annuity, because we understand that, a gene therapy is expensive, and, something that might have a $2 million price tag is a lot for an insurance company to swallow at one time, even if they only have 10 or 15 patients on, who are eligible. It's still, 20-30 million dollars. So, we've seen a lot of companies try to break up the cost of that through an annuity, whether it's a 10-year, 5-year, what have you. So that seems to be, helping with the uptake and acceptance of some of the more expensive therapies like the gene therapies. There's also, and I don't know if this necessarily solves the cost issue per se, but there's now contracts that we have with different payers around metrics. So, did the therapy actually behave, as expected? So, if it does, you pay the full amount. If it doesn't, there's some discount. So there's different modalities, that can, spread the risk, spread the cost out. I still think that there's probably more that will be we'll see in the future. There's probably things that I am not aware of that we could do one day to, to really make this a partnership. In the US, I think, again, we've had fairly good success with uptake in these newer contracts. Europe's still very hard. I mean, Europe is, a central payer in each country, and, you really have to prove that therapy is necessary and better than something else on the market. And we've seen a number of, gene therapies not do so well, and, basically exit Europe. So there's still more I think we need to do in Europe to make the gene therapy successful, but we're going to keep trying, because I think at the end of the day, that's where the industry is going. And, if you can really, fix the problem through administration of a gene therapy, I think we're obligated to find a way to, work with the health authorities to get them to pay for it. But it's still a work in progress, especially in Europe.
100%. Gene therapies are such an exciting new technology and science. I know that Chiesi has lots of different partnerships with different companies, but one that kind of comes to my mind theoretically in the future, as we consider precision medicine and being able to appropriately diagnose genetic disorders, is I'm thinking about companies like the 23andMe's, et cetera, where it makes genetic testing accessible to the entire population across the globe. Is there potential opportunities for partnerships at that level? And the second part to that question is, do you and your company believe that genetic testing is the way of the future as we think about data lakes and data oceans, and thinking about really doing forensic, optimization of that data to determine population dynamics, and seeing if certain, environmental factors are creating these genetic situations in certain parts of the world? What do you say about those potential partnerships and the future of genetic testing?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's the future, and I wouldn't say it's too far off from the future. It's probably almost here. So yeah, I think there's opportunities for partnerships with 23andMe, Ancestry, those types of companies. I know in my past we've explored some of those, and yeah, the challenge is around rare disease and whether the companies gather the information on just certain genes, or do they actually do a full genome sequencing and have all the data on all the genes? But there's definitely an opportunity there with that. I really think the wave of the future, though, is newborn screening. So, there's a panel right now where kids get tested for certain genetic disorders upon birth, but it's not a true genetic panel. And with the prices coming down so much for genetic testing, in some cases, again, under 300 or maybe even less than that, there's an opportunity, I think, in the not too distant future to get every newborn's genetic sequence. So a lot of these diseases are, impacting, children right away from birth. And if we can diagnose virtually everybody upon birth, I mean, you can really interrupt the patient journey. I mean, it would be amazing to we have roughly 4 million births a year, and if we can really get the critical mass up and run testing on all those babies, and stop these diseases really before they start, I mean, that would be amazing. I mean, I think that's really where we're going. And, I think that would almost obviate the need for like a 23andMe and Ancestry, because as you test each generation or each, cohort of newborns, then everybody's going to have their genetic sequence. So I think it's an exciting time. I mean, there's a lot of work going on in the testing space for newborns, and I would not be surprised within the next 5-10 years if it becomes reality.
Yeah, so I think it's some great conversation. Certainly, some ethical things I think that have to be worked
Sure.
out. I'm sure that those conversations are happening. But again, overlapping that with artificial intelligence, smart algorithms, et cetera, population health management is probably going to be, like you said, a really exciting space. So I do have also a question. You said that you built in some ways your team during COVID. There's been obviously that has accelerated and decelerated many different things in the world. And so I was just kind of curious about your thoughts on building teams, the idea of building culture, and more importantly, engagement of physicians and other key healthcare stakeholders in a virtual space. How were you doing this, and what kinds of recommendations or suggestions would you have for somebody who might have to do something like that in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, building the team, and building the culture. I think, first of all, our company, as I mentioned, Giacomo, who's the head of our business, he kind of set the tone for, collaboration and patient centricity. So, when building the team, even though it was virtual, I was looking for people who I felt were collaborative, but also had, much different skills than I do. I mean, I'll be the first to admit, I'm not the market access expert. I haven't been doing that for 20 years. I obviously have knowledge in the space, but I really looked for complementary people who had skills that, would mesh, would actually cover up for things maybe I don't know about. Because I think that's, as a leader, you really need to look at what what your deficits are, and try to bring people in who can complement your deficits. I think in this world, especially, as you move up the leadership in companies, you also lose a little bit of touch with some of the things around the digital space. I really wanted to bring in people who knew about digital marketing, knew about TikTok. I mean, I'm not a TikTok guy, but I know we need to connect with the patients through TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So really bringing in those complementary skills. And then so once the team was formed, though, the challenge was around how do you make it a team? You have people, but how do you make it a team? So we just really tried to do everything we could to get together. We did the outside lunches, with masks and all that. But through, I think, a really good effort to try and bring people together, and then also I think hiring really solid people who get along. We've built a good culture. It's a very it's a transparent group, and I think we all genuinely enjoy working with one another. So it's kind of nice when you see that. I think the other part of your question was around working with a physician. I don't think there's a magic bullet for it. I mean, we went to a much more virtual platform, from a sales team perspective. There were opportunities for the MSLs to meet virtually with physicians, but I think nothing's going to completely substitute for in person. There's something about building a relationship with physicians externally through in-person means. But the other thing we had to step up were use of digital platforms, whether it was for education purposes with emails, not that this is so rocket science, but we had to install an RM program for physicians and patients, at Chiesi when I got here, because we didn't really have one to reach out to physicians. So we really spent a lot on the digital side to make sure that we could interact with physicians and with patients on the disease education side, and and then symposia and meetings at conferences. We built virtual booths and virtual symposia to connect with the physicians. But at the end of the day, I still think there's probably a ways to go. We probably we learned a lot. I think we we're fairly successful with the interactions, but not having in person is definitely a deficit. And right now it's a lot better because we have a better mix of in person and out of office interaction.
So it sounds like hybrid, you think is the way of the future. Do you think
I
that?
think so.
Yeah, interesting. Very cool. Sounds like a lot of exciting things going on with Chiesi and yourself in the rare disorder space. Sounds like you're doing some great advances there. I think it's really exciting, and congratulations to you and your team for some of the wonderful work that you're doing for patients who really, really need your medicines. For anybody who's interested in speaking with Larry, please look for his contact details in the show notes below. If you enjoyed this show, please check out impetusdigital.com. We are happy actually to work with various stakeholders in a series of synchronous and asynchronous touch points to talk about these things. Rare disorders, what are you doing? What is the clinical endpoints for your trials? How are you going to look for patients and other kinds of solves? We can actually do this in a really effective and efficient manner. Please like and subscribe to our channel, and we'd really appreciate if you can leave us some feedback on iTunes. We want to thank everybody for their time, and thank you, Larry, for an outstanding conversation.